From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. We now know exactly when the Texas law banning nearly all abortions will go into effect. That's where we'll start with the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics. The Texas law banning nearly all abortions will go into effect August 25th. On Tuesday, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its judgment in Dobbs versus Jackson, the Mississippi case overturning a woman's right to access abortion health care, sending the decision back down to the states. The judgment started the 30-day clock for the Texas law to go into effect. Starting August 25th, performing an abortion will be a first-degree felony unless a woman's life is in danger. The law makes no exception for cases of rape, incest, severe fetal abnormalities, or women who express intent to do self-harm. In an advisory, Attorney General Ken Paxton said his office stands ready to help any local prosecutor pursue criminal charges according to the law. As families in Uvalde continue to call for accountability after a gunman shot and killed 19 students and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School, the principal of the school was placed on leave, then reinstated this week. Mandy Gutierrez was placed on paid administrative leave Monday. Gutierrez has come under scrutiny after a House committee report detailing the shooting revealed staff at Robb Elementary had a culture of complacency about security and broken locks were not fixed. Gutierrez refuted those claims in a letter to the committee, saying a custodian checked all classroom locks every night. The next day, her attorney shared a letter from the superintendent saying she can resume her duties as principal. Meanwhile, the school board and Uvalde City Council both voted to send resolutions to Governor Greg Abbott asking him to call a special session to raise the age to buy an assault rifle from 18 to 21. In an interview with KVUE's sister station in Houston, Governor Abbott would not say if he will or won't call a special session. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is no longer testing positive for COVID-19. According to his campaign, he tested positive last Saturday and had mild symptoms. Friday, the campaign shared Patrick tested negative and is symptom-free. This week, the GDP, gross domestic product, shrunk for the second quarter in a row. By standard definition, that negative growth of the U.S. economy signals a recession. But most economists say that's not the case for the United States in this moment. Dr. Ray Perryman, economist and president and CEO of economic research and analysis firm the Perryman Group, joined me to explain why. You know, this week there has been a lot of talk about the big R word. The head of the Federal Reserve says the U.S. is not in a recession, at least not yet. The White House echoed that message that we are not in a recession, but some Republican politicians, including Governor Greg Abbott, say we are. You are an expert with more than 40 years of experience on this. What do you say?
I really don't think we are. We saw the numbers this morning. The gross domestic product has now declined 2 straight quarters, which is one definition people use sometimes. But the previous quarter was primarily because we were unloading some boats. We got our imports back up and solved some supply chain problems. You're really not in a recession when you're gaining 400,000 jobs a month. And so I think certainly we're having a lot of headwinds in the economy. There are a lot of challenges right now. From an individual's perspective in your own life, it really doesn't matter if you call it a recession or not, but we're not seeing the types of things you typically see in a recession economy at this point in time.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that you said is one of the key reasons why the Fed says we're not in a recession. That's the job market, right? The unemployment rate in the U.S. is near a 50-year low. Wages are growing. Businesses are hiring. So, you know, how big of a factor does job growth play into the recession equation?
Well, it's very important because basically the question in recession is, are you growing or not? If the economy continues to hire several 100,000 people every month, it's still in a growth mode. Now we're facing a lot of headwinds, inflation challenges, supply chain challenges, many other things. Households are having to deal with these things. But underneath all of that, there's also some indicators showing that we continue to grow.
Yeah. So a lot of economists, though, are still warning that a recession is probably coming either later this year or in 2023. In your opinion, tell us what would really signal a recession?
Well, to me, what we'd see is some of the things we're seeing now, in addition to some weakness in the job market. We'd probably see consumer spending falling. It's still rising modestly right now. There'd be basically a confluence of things that are all going down at the same time, spreading across a large span of industries. And we're simply not seeing that at this point in time. We may or may not see it in the future. Personally, I think we will avoid a recession, certainly will avoid a severe recession, but we are facing a lot of challenges in the economy right now that are bringing some hardship for a lot of folks.
More on the state of the economy when Texas This Week continues. Welcome back. This week, the GDP fell for the second consecutive quarter, but economists say job growth in the U.S. is keeping the country out of a recession. Still, record high inflation and the Fed's decision to aggressively raise interest rates means many of us are feeling the pinch. So what's on the horizon? Let's continue our conversation with economist and president and CEO of the Perryman Group, Dr. Ray Perryman. Earlier this week, the Fed decided to increase interest rates again to try to combat our record high inflation. Now, raising interest rates is supposed to deter people from borrowing money, slowing demand so that those prices fall. But in Texas, we're still seeing record spending, so much spending that the comptroller had to revise his revenue estimate, increasing it by $14 billion. So explain to us again, make it make sense, Dr. Perryman, how does raising rates help?
Sure. Well, raising rates basically raises the cost of borrowing money initially just in a fairly limited area where the Federal Reserve controls. But beyond that, it makes its way into mortgage rates to some extent. It makes its way into credit card rates, the prime rate at banks, which affects lending rates for a lot of companies. A lot of other loans are tied to the prime rate. So it does have a lot of impact there. What we're seeing in Texas is a lot of underlying strength in our economy, but also a big part of the controller's increase in revenue, which is very welcome for Texas, is what's happening in the oil and gas industry, because that's generating a tremendous amount of severance tax revenue, sales tax revenue, many other types of revenue that come into play, the franchise tax revenue. All of that's being driven by some real underlying strength in the oil and gas sector, which allows Texas a little bit of cushion that some states don't have.
You know, folks are feeling it at home. And so whether you say we're in a recession or not in a recession, headed to one or not, people at home say, I'm having to pay, almost double for some of the products. Is that going to correct itself?
Well, again, to some extent it will. I think by the end of the year, you'll see inflation being a lot lower than it is right now. In some cases, you'll actually see prices falling from the levels we've seen recently. Things like used cars that were terrifically inflated by the situation when we couldn't get chips in to make new cars, those kinds of things. I think you will see a lot better situation with inflation in a few months than you're seeing right now. And I think for most people right now, I mean, as you pointed out, we're pretty close to full employment. Most people that want a job have a job. Wages are going up. The real thing that's hitting people right now is not the traditional things you have in a recession, but it's the inflationary hit. It's the fact that the things you buy every month are costing more, and consequently that forces you to make some decisions that you wouldn't have to make otherwise. And I think that's the issue that's really probably confronting most households and consumers more so than the underlying economy in terms of whether or not we're in a recession.
In your opinion, what really is the state of our economy, both for Texas and for the United States right now?
Well, at this point in time, again, I think there's some underlying factors that look strong, look like we can move forward in a productive way. Growth slowing, certainly, but not seeing a big decline in jobs or anything of that nature. Texas is doing a little better than the country as a whole, but both the U.S. economy and the Texas economy are facing the headwinds. The inflation we're having is very important. Now, an important distinction for people to make is that everybody wants to compare this to the 70s and 80s. I was actually an economist even back then. And this one is not structural. That is, we haven't institutionalized this inflation like we did back in those days. This is one that's tied by a crazy set of circumstances coming into play at once. The coming out of a pandemic, a lot of extra money in people's pockets, supply chain challenges trying to get started, the war in the Ukraine disrupting things, China shutting down production again. I mean, we really had a perfect storm of things that generated this inflation, but they're all the kinds of things that get fixed over time without having to make big structural changes in the economy.
You can learn more about Dr. Perryman and find a link to his latest publications in the Texas This Week section of KVUE.com.